Hi, thanks so much.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Good luck.
Thank you. Hello. I would like for you to imagine a scientist. Tell me what you see. What do they look like? What are they wearing? Where are they working? And if you're picturing an image now that looks something like this, then you are like so many other adults and even children across generations who think that a scientist has an unkempt beard and big glasses and works in a lab. But that's a challenge. You see, science isn't a job. It's a way of thinking. In fact, it's the best way we have for understanding truth in the world. And at this point, when it's so difficult for us to separate fact from fiction, myth from reality, we need the best tool that we have. And yet, there's a challenge. So few of us have studied science or the scientific method in our work. It's not a part of how our companies operate. It's not a part of our strategic frameworks. Maybe we studied a little bit of the scientific method when we were in grade school, maybe trying to understand how peas grow. And that's the last time that we formulated a hypothesis and tested it with an experiment. And yet that method is the very best methodology that we have for understanding the truth. We need to bring that methodology into our work. And in fact, here's the thing. It's not as if it's difficult for us to bring scientific thinking into our work. I want us to challenge that. I don't want you to think that a scientist is someone who wears that lab coat, who sits in that lab and has the bad hair. I want you to recognize yourself, me, the people around you, as scientific thinkers. That's what we need to feel comfortable embracing. And I want to give you the building blocks for scientific thinking as a part of this. Because it's time that we reframe how we think about science. We need to make this a part of our work. Okay, how do we do this? How can you discover that scientific thinker that's within you? I want to give you a very simple example, and hopefully that will bring it to light in terms of how much you already have there. Let's just imagine that you're at the grocery store, and you're in the slowest line. That happens, right? We're in the slowest line. And what do we find ourselves doing? We find ourselves, kind of doing this thing where you're trying to see how fast the guy with the red shirt is moving in the other lane compared to our lane. Maybe we're looking at what kind of, groceries, for instance, that the person might have in their cart. Maybe they have a lot of vegetables, and those always seem to take a while. Or maybe, there's just not enough lanes at the store, and you're starting to think about that as an issue. Or maybe you think that it's the cashier who's inefficient in helping the customers. Okay, this isn't a comprehensive analysis of grocery stores. What this is helping you recognize the elements of that everyday experience that contain some of the fundamental building blocks for scientific thinking. Let's review what those elements were. So first of all, making empirical observations. I gave you the example of trying to calculate how slow the line was relative to another line. Here you are, making an empirical observation, trying to create data out of what you're seeing in the world. The second thing is starting to develop theories about root causes. We thought that maybe it was the customers or the cashier or some other element of the store that was contributing to this experience. And thirdly, it's this process of starting to propose solutions. OK, that seems intuitively obvious, right? You must feel comfortable with that. You must feel comfortable already seeing 3 of the building blocks of scientific thinking. And so, as leaders, as strategists, it's important for us to bring this kind of methodology into our organizations. Our customers, our employees, our stakeholders deserve the best thinking that we have. But here's the thing. Here's one of the most critical and powerful elements of scientific thinking that I encourage you to embrace. You see, science isn't about using data to prove ourselves right. It's actually undertaking an exhaustive effort to prove ourselves wrong. This is one of the unique characteristics of science. And here's how it's done. One of the ways is to actually look at prior research. Now, I'm not an expert in grocery store design, but what I wanted to do was an experiment to find out how much I could already learn about the science of standing in lines by looking at prior literature. And so I was able to do a comprehensive analysis simply by going here, by looking at published research by scientists who have actually already studied this quite a bit. In fact, there's even a professor who goes by the name of Professor Q. That's the British way of saying standing in line, and that's his expertise. And from here, I learned all kinds of very interesting things. So one of the things that I learned was that it's not so much the actual process of standing in line that matters. It's the feeling that people have about standing in line. I learned some things like, even if we make the line faster, we'll still have lines. There still will be a challenge that we'll still have people in lines. And people will still, even if that line moves significantly faster, no matter how fast we can make those lines move, we will still have people standing in the slowest lines. So what else can we do to improve the experience that the customer has? Well, it turns out that some of the most fascinating aspects of human psychology are our inability to make reliable estimates. Fascinating research was done that asked people how long they estimated a line would take. And I encourage you to try this yourself. Next time you see a line, do a guess. How long do you estimate that this line will take you? And then it turns out that people have a significant margin of error when they make this estimation. And guess which direction their error is? Do you think that they think that the line will be quicker, or do you think that people generally assume that the line will take much longer than it actually does? And in fact, that is the case. So that's fine for estimation. But what about after we get through the line? It turns out that even after we've finished our transaction, our shopping, when we've gone through it, when we ask people, OK, how long did you stand in that line? People tend to give you estimates that are as much as 40% longer than the time that they actually spent. So now it seems that maybe we're on a better path for helping improve the customer experience, not by solving the problem of the line, but by addressing people's perception and their experience of standing in the line. And so then solutions might be things that are not operational in nature, but instead take into consideration people's psychology. So addressing people's misperception of the time that it would take. Some retailers have successfully used indicators, like if you're at this point, it typically takes us 10 minutes from here. But if it took us longer today, please let us know. That gives customers a great deal of certainty and happiness without actually investing in trying to make the overall process faster. Another example, a very creative idea, is something that was done by the head of operations at a Texas airport. And I thought you would like this example because I assume that many of you travel often, like I do, and find elements of the experience frustrating. So this head of operations at the airport was getting many, many complaints from the most valuable customers, and that was the business traveler, about how long it was taking for the baggage to arrive from the airplane to the luggage carousel. What would happen is the business traveler would exit the plane, and it was a 1-minute walk to get to where the luggage carousel was. Now, other passengers without luggage would pass by the business travelers and then would go to the taxi stand. And then they would start building up a new line for the taxis, while the business people waiting for their luggage would get increasingly frustrated. But here's the thing. The record of this company's time to go from the airplane to the luggage carousel was 8 minutes. The passengers walked 1 minute to the carousel, and then they would wait there 7 minutes for the luggage to arrive as people passed. It wasn't possible to make the luggage any faster from the plane to the carousel. So here's what he did. Understanding how people feel about their status, understanding how important it is for the business traveler to be able to move efficiently to the taxi stand, he simply moved things around so that to get to the luggage and to get to the exit where the taxi stand was, it was now a 7-minute walk. So instead of waiting for the luggage to arrive, people have to walk the 7 minutes, grab their luggage, and then could leave. So there was no other change other than moving which exits and gates that the plane used to increase the walk time. And this is, again, by understanding the feeling that people have. It wasn't so much about now the 8 minutes. It was about losing their sense of status and the ability to maintain their speed through the system. When you bring psychology insights to your strategies, it helps you to be exponentially more creative, to try ideas and to consider approaches that you wouldn't have otherwise considered. And in fact, in this case of the head of operations for the airport, he no longer received any complaints. So let's then finish the building blocks of scientific thinking. The first part, through the cashier example, was potentially intuitively obvious. But now I hope I've walked you through some additional building blocks of scientific thinking. That is to leverage prior research when you think you have an idea, when you think you have an understanding of the problem. I invite you to look at research that's already been done. Then that will help you to refine your theories about what solutions will be effective, and then to experiment. Gather data to test your hypotheses, to determine what is most effective, and learn from what wasn't effective. So I want to cover off 3 things today. One is this how to think like a scientist. And I feel like I'll be successful in this talk if you feel comfortable identifying yourself as a scientific thinker and start to recognize and use that kind of language in your work. The second thing that I want to do next is to introduce behavioral economics to you so that you understand the foundational theories and the insights that it has to offer. And then last but not least, this is the fun part, where we actually start to get concrete. And I'm going to share with you a very specific framework in terms of how you can actually do behavioral economics in your organization to transform it to be more innovative. So what is behavioral economics? First, we need to recognize that actually we're all in the business of behavior change. If you're here from marketing, you're trying to persuade people to open an account, buy a product, be loyal to your company. If you are in some form of experience, you are trying to have your customers be loyal or engaged with your organization. If you're in operations, maybe you're dealing with things like fraud or efficiency, or maybe you're working on employee motivation and productivity. All of these questions are fundamentally about trying to get people to do things, to behave in a certain way. You're already behavioral scientist, but now I want to give you theory and insights to help you potentially be more effective and more innovative at that. Let's cover some theory that is foundational to the definition of behavioral economics. This is the professor and me making sure that you have the foundation in the theory at your fingertips. Behavioral economics evolved really in the 1950s. So it's been a little while within academia that the ideas have been developing. And only over the last 10 years has it really started to see its application in the real world. So how did those theories evolve? Well, it started with this notion that challenged traditional economics. And I'm not sure how many economic scholars that we have here in the room, but the models that we build using economics assume something very important. It assumes that people are rational. It assumes that if we give people enough information, or they're given an incentive in the form of an inducement, a positive incentive, or a punishment, a negative incentive, that people will react in equal units. They will act commiserate to the value of that incentive. That's what traditional economics is based on, that we're rational and that we will react to a good search for information and that our behavior will align to those incentives. But when we actually look at how people behave, we see so many inconsistencies with that theory. We see that, in fact, people are not always rational. Why? Well, we don't always have enough time to make an exhaustive search for all of the information that we need to make a calculated decision. Or other times, we don't have all of the mental energy, or maybe even the mental capacity to engage in some of the more complex decisions that our society faces, like how do we optimize our retirement savings? Some of the information that's necessary to make a decision like that is very complex. And then lastly, another fundamental challenge to our ability to act rationally is that we have limited willpower, that there's a gap between what we say and what we actually do. So then this combines to create this notion of, it's not that we're always irrational. That's not the way that we should think of ourselves or our customers. But we should respect the fact that we're boundedly rational. It means our rationality is limited to very specific times and context, and that other times we can be very vulnerable to other approaches to making decisions. Now, one of those is to use mental shortcuts, or use the Greek word heuristics. This is this idea that we can use shortcuts to help our decisions. Now, sometimes those shortcuts are great, simply looking to an expert to give us guidance, or to follow the crowd. What most people are doing is sometimes a very logical and safe approach to helping us make a decision. The challenge, though, with both of those instances is that we can be vulnerable to bias. We might want someone to be an expert. We might not recognize potentially the conflict of interest in the advice that they're giving us. And so even though we want them to be an expert in giving us good advice, in fact, that they might not be a good advisor for us. Or in the case of following what other people are doing as social proof, that too is vulnerable to bias. Sometimes people in a group are actually making a very bad decision, and so it is wrong for us to follow that advice. Those are two examples of the relationship between us making a shortcut in the thing that we do and the vulnerability that that decision can have to a bias. So with that, we actually have the foundational theoretical elements of behavioral economics. Now, this field has continued to explode. If you look at Wikipedia, for instance, and if you go to wikipedia.com, you'll see a list of biases. In fact, you'll see hundreds of them now. It's this list that's continuing to explode. As now we're starting to study behavior scientifically, as now we're studying behavior in the real world, we're developing a more and more nuanced understanding of the kinds of biases that we have. But the thing that makes behavioral economics very powerful for us to use in business and in policy is the fact that we're actually predictably irrational. And let me show you an example. Now, some of you may be familiar with this data set, but often I find that many are not. The data that we're looking at right now, well, you could see it's very low on the end where the bars are blue and very high on the other side. What is the data that we're looking at? It's organ donation participation rates. That is, donating our organs in the event of our death. Now, if you ask people what they think about organ donation, in many countries around the world, people typically say that they think that it's the right thing to do, and they support it. Now, there are some religious groups, there are some folks who are nervous about those kinds of medical procedures, and some other very minor audiences that don't support it, but in general, it's something that is very supported. So, why does this data set show such a discrepancy? The enrollment process for organ donation in these countries is actually the same. It's a part of the driver's license, registration, or even the renewal is where the issue of organ donation is presented. So why in countries like Germany and the Netherlands or Denmark is participation so low? Are they that different than sister countries like Austria or Belgium or Sweden? Is it a question of demographics? No, they're similar. Is it a question of education? No, the approach is the same. Is it something else about the values of that country? No. It is simply this. Consent is implied in the countries where the participation rate is high. All you have to do is pick up a pen to opt out. In the countries where the participation rate is low, you have to pick up the pen to opt in. So the friction to act on this belief is very low, and yet we see the powerful sway that something as simple as the design of a form can have on people's choice. We call this choice architecture. What this shows us is the power of default in influencing the decisions that people make. Here's something about behavioral economics that's very fundamental for you to understand. Behavioral economics is all about how do we leverage our biases to help people make better decisions. Let me show you another example. When it comes to our financial savings, retirement is a very complex decision. It's very difficult to save today for this long-term future. It's a very difficult problem in general for us to solve. One of the features of employment in many countries is employers offering a retirement savings plan. And that's where employees are able to put a percentage of their salary immediately into a long-term savings account, and then that income has tax deferred. And so it's a very powerful financial investment to put your money into a retirement savings account. In fact, some employers even match what employees will put in to a limit as a further incentive for them to invest. But it turns out that we can see from the dark line on the bottom that it takes over 5 years for employees to reach over 50% enrollment in their company's retirement savings plan when they're left to their own devices. Why? Let's take that perspective for a moment. When you think about retirement savings, first of all, you have a number of very complex decisions. How much should I save? What should I invest in? Then, even if they make those decisions, then it's, oh, it's so difficult for me now to give up income that I have, so I'll do this another time. Or they're afraid of making a mistake, so we procrastinate. This is what happens. So what is a way that we can use behavioral economics, then, to help us lead people to making a better solution? And that is, let's use the power of default. Let's default employees in to a retirement savings program the day that they sign up for the company. But let's not take away choice. Let's still allow people to opt out, allow people to change the amount that is set up as the default savings amount, let people change the investment vehicle that they're put in, but at least something is better than nothing. And we're not taking away their choice, but we're putting them in something that is a net benefit. Or is it? Or is it a net benefit to default people in? So here's a caution about behavioral economics. I've shown you two examples. For instance, this power of default is incredibly effective at swaying human behavior. So just because we can influence people's behavior doesn't necessarily mean that we should. In the case of the retirement savings examples, we probably have some people very savvy at finance here. We know some of those consequences. There's a time in some people's lives, if they have a lot of high-interest debt or loans, that they shouldn't be investing in long-term savings. They should prioritize paying down that debt. Or we might be putting people in the wrong investment vehicle based on their risk, their life stage, and other factors that might be better suited for a different investment type. So the question then to ask yourself, though, about behavioral economics is, am I being ethical when we're using these tools? Fundamentally, ask yourself, who is the beneficiary of this tactic that I am using? Is it the company, or is it in the best interest of the customer? There was a case in Canada where a very large cable company developed a whole new set of TV stations, and then with that, they put together new bundles for the TV channels, which is exciting. That's great. But what they did was they went through their customer database, and they upgraded all of the customers, defaulting them into a new bundle that cost more than the bundle that they had today, with the hopes that they would be able to enjoy significant new revenues, and that customers would be happy with the new channels that they received in these bundles. That's not what happened. There was outcry. People were defaulted into a package that cost more, as opposed to defaulted into a package that cost less, with the opportunity for marketing to do its job in encouraging customers to try a new bundle. The consequence of this action, this cable company lost its license to serve that market for several years as a penalty of abusing this power of default. And so we need to take this as a lesson that how we use behavioral economics can have a significant impact on our customers, and we need to make sure that we're making a decision in their best interest. So what is behavioral economics then? So it's three things. So many of our organizations are split apart, right? We've got our research team, and they're busy doing insights. We've got our strategy team coming up with new ways and new tactics to influence behavior. And then we have the team that builds and executes. Maybe they do a pilot, but really they're bringing things to life in the market. And it's very, very deconstructed. Behavioral economics brings us an end-to-end spectrum for bringing ideas to life with new insights, new strategies to understand consumers, and a methodology by which to test. This is where I want to tell you a little bit about behavioral economics and how it impacted my life and my career. You see, I started out as a little girl, kind of interested in technology. And I remember when my parents got the first VCR so that we could watch tapes of movies. And I was the one who had to take this machine out of the box and program it and set this thing up. And look, I wasn't really that interested in the technology itself, but it was very exciting bringing this process, this experience of all of these movies to life, and my mom was so happy being able to watch all of these movies. And then things started to change. We started to have a Friday night movie night, a Saturday night movie night. Friends wanted to come over and hang out with me. I made more friends. My parents bought new furniture. We got one of those big couches that wraps around. My dad bought one of those big 4-foot TVs with the 3 bright lights of color. We even turned the garage into a movie room. And we got a popcorn machine, all from the VCR. I was very curious about how technology can change our lives, can change our behavior. How is it that people adopt technology in a way that has a significant impact on who they are? That question didn't leave me. As I went through university and I studied philosophy and I studied technology and looked at things like internet-based technologies and started my career then looking at startups in the early 90s, building startups in the publishing world, and getting people to forego reading newspapers and magazines for going online. And we faced all kinds of challenges in terms of getting people to pay for subscriptions online. So this became an incredible experience, and just because we can build it doesn't mean that people will use it. So my question's then about how do we drive adoption of technology? Just because we build it, how do we understand their psychology? So then I worked in strategy and innovation for many, many years in the banking sector, doing things like building the online banking channel. And I was tasked with trying to understand, why do customers still go into the branch to pay their bills when we have a beautiful capability online? It's easy, it's fast, you get all of the receipts. So why do people still stand in those long lines in the branch at the same time with all of their papers to make bill payments? And so this is when I had the opportunity to apply my knowledge of behavioral economics and design a field experiment that tested new ways to impact and influence consumers' behavior. Because just because we build it doesn't mean they're going to adopt it. Behavioral economics gives us rich insights, new tactics, and then a way to experiment to overcome those kinds of barriers. And in a world now where we have things like artificial intelligence to augment the ideas that doctors have, that traders have, how do we get them to incorporate those insights into their work? This is a very ripe time for behavioral economics and helping drive the transformation of technology and changing society. Okay, so I would like for us to do an activity together. This is where you should get your phone and use the Pulse app. Be ready to vote. Your voting will be very important and exciting to participate in. So make sure you have that ready to go. As I'm going to present to you a scenario, and then at the end of the scenario, I'm going to ask you which strategy we should invest in. And your intuition about what you think might work is very important to capture so that you can say, I think it's number 2 that we should do, and here's why. Make sure you hold on to that intuition. That's an important part of the scientific method. Okay, so here's the problem that we're going to solve. So the problem we're going to solve is, how do we increase the rate of savings amongst people who are very, very poor? We did a project in Nairobi, Kenya, with people who had cell phones, M-Pesa application, if you're familiar with that, and they had a bank account that was attached to it. So it was very easy for people to potentially save money through their cell phone if they wanted to. But the motivation and the behavior to do so was very low. So we hypothesized that behavioral economics could help us develop solutions that would increase savings. And we wanted to test a number of hypotheses. So one of them was, what is the impact of giving people reminders to save? Will that lead to an increase in saving? Specifically, here's what it looked like. We give them a text reminder. There were two of them, one at the beginning of the week that said, hey, please don't forget to save this week. And then at the end of the week, they received a text message that had their balance of the account. So these are the messages that they were now able to receive on their phone. Now, we also tested a different variation. When people enrolled in this program, we knew if they were parents and if they had children, and we asked them what the names of their children were. So we were able to personalize the text message to the parents that were in this experimental condition to say, hi, mommy, please deposit as much as you can for our future. And then it was signed with the name of the child or the children. Now, I don't know about you, but I have a daughter, and she regularly asks me for money. So it's very interesting for me to see how this experiment played out in the real world. Now, we tested this with over 3,000 customers for a 6-month time period. So I'll be able to share the data of how that one did. So the next thing that we tested was this whole idea of giving people an incentive. If we give people an incentive, we give them free money, then that should increase their likelihood to save. So one of the conditions was to give people a match of 10%. So for every dollar they saved, we gave them 10 cents. Now, the other condition is very important for you to think about as well. Remember, when you're designing experiments, you're testing a hypothesis. And so what that means is, if you have a hunch that something might work, like an incentive, then why not double down? Why not try that particular idea even further, an even more extreme version of that one idea? Because we're curious. We want to see what's going to happen. If we think that 10% might work, what happens when we do 20%? Now, of course, economically, that's very expensive to give people a 20% match. But remember, we're only in the experiment. It's only a few hundred people in this individual condition, so we can budget against that, but it'll help us learn. It'll help us learn what the value is of incentive on people's behavior. OK, so this way, we're giving them the incentive at the end of the week, like as a reward, right? So there's another way that we can do this. We can give it to them at the beginning of the week. This uses the thing called the power of loss aversion. In fact, loss aversion is a very interesting concept. It turns out that if we were to win $100, the joy that we feel for winning $100 is only half as intense as the pain of losing $100. We don't have an equal feeling about our money. So in fact, when we lose something, we feel the pain of that twice as much as gaining something of equal value. That's the psychology known as loss aversion. So we thought, why don't we test that as well? Why don't we do a calculation that determines how much a 10% match would be for that customer for that week? And let's actually put it into the account at the beginning of the week, give them the message that says you'll get X if you save this week, and then you'll lose it if you did not save. And it was set up so it was in an escrow account, but they could actually see the balance as if it was in their own account. And then we were able to take it out of the account in the case that they didn't save. So this is using this power of loss aversion. And it was done for both the 10% and the 20% incentive amounts. OK, now here's the last thing that we tested. This is a golden coin. It was designed to fit into the palm of your hand. And on the outside of the coin were numbers. It's not a real gold coin. It's just spray-painted gold. And then every week of the program, if they saved that week, they were instructed to scratch off the number that's on the outside of the coin that corresponds to the week it is in this 6-month campaign. If you didn't save that week, then don't scratch it off. That's the instructions. OK, now here's your question. So we have each of these conditions, and I want you to vote, and then we will be our information in terms of how we all think will be displayed for us to see. So vote number 1 if you think it's the weekly text reminder. 2 if it's the one from the kids. 3 if it's the 10% match at the end of the week as the reward. 4 if it's the variation that's worth 20%. 5 if you like the loss aversion and you think that'll be most effective at increasing people's likelihood to save at the 20% value. Or vote 7 if you think it was the coin that made a difference. And we should look to see our own data coming up on the screen. And here's our votes right now. Let me just take a look. So it's so incredible to be able to vote like this, to see what's happening in terms of where people guess. This has been consistent every time I've shared with people this experiment. This is generally how people vote. We tend to think that the 20% loss aversion is the most logical, or the message from kids is incredibly powerful, right? But here's the thing. We ran an experiment in the real world with 3,000 people, and I'll tell you what happened. For that small group of you that voted for the coin, the 15% of you, barely over 1 out of 10 of you, you're the one that is correct. The one that had the greatest impact on people's likelihood to save is the coin. Now, if we had time, I would love to discuss this with you. But I think that maybe some of the things that we would hear from our colleagues whose intuition suggested the coin, they would say things like, well, savings is very abstract. It's very long term, and you don't see it or feel it. And the coin gives you something tangible. That's right. That's the hypothesis that was tested. And there was another element of this hypothesis as well, which was this immediate reward that you get from being able to scratch off one of those numbers. You feel as if you're getting immediate recognition. But a third hypothesis is this actually being able to see your progress and wanting to keep that streak going. So these are 3 of the hypotheses that we have as to why the coin outperformed the other conditions. Fine. But there's another takeaway for us in this. Another takeaway is that what happens in our boardroom, what happens in our organization when we have a hypothesis and no one else believes us? How do we actually get our ideas to the table, especially ones that are counterintuitive as giving people coins? What happens? How are those ideas brought to life? And this is one of the challenges with innovation, is that we don't necessarily have a framework in absence of using the scientific method to help us bring ideas that are counterintuitive, that few people actually support, to bring those ideas to life. And this is the thing. We have been saying for years how difficult it is for us to have innovation inside our organizations. This was a survey that was done with senior executives all over the world, and only 35% of them believe in our team's ability to actually be innovative. So how can our companies survive if our own leaders don't have confidence in our ability to respond dynamically and creatively to the times? Leaders say that they want innovation, and yet they don't recognize that there are behavioral barriers standing in the way. So one of the experiences that we had was I was having dinner with the CEO of a banking client of ours, and we had done a lot of very exciting work helping them make their credit card product more innovative. We were doing work like helping people pay their bills on time. And we came across this research study that suggested that if we give customers their overdue bills on color paper, that they're more likely to get their bills paid. So we thought, OK, this is a very nice experiment. Let's go to the head of the billing department and give him this research paper and encourage him to run an experiment. And we designed an experiment for him. We gave him the numbers in terms of how many people ought to be in this experiment. And we calculated that the experiment would cost around $500 for the additional paper, because color paper costs more than white paper. It's like triple the cost for color paper. And we thought, let's run an experiment. Here's how many we need in the sample to make sure that we can get reliable data back on, does this actually lead to an improvement in people's likelihood to repay? So we thought, this is great. We could be a company that tests something very simple. Let's see if it works. And I explained this to her. And I said, do you want to know what your billing, the head of billing said? He said, well, there's no way we can do this, because color paper costs 3 times the price of what a white piece of paper cost. So without even wanting to figure out whether or not we get a net positive impact to customers' behavior, he wasn't willing and able to go ahead with the idea. You see, the framework for experimentation, the license, the understanding, and even the budget, as well as the culture readiness for being able to fail and learn from failing, wasn't adopted and embraced inside the organization. We as a team were able to go in and help them run experiments, but when we asked the team themselves to run experiments, they had not embraced the scientific method yet as a way to build strategy. She hit her head on the table as I was telling her this story, and then we moved forward with thinking about things like, how do we bring the culture of innovation and the framework of scientific method and behavioral insights to life inside the organization so people know how. People know how. Because innovation, it's an outcome. It's an outcome of a process. It's more than just something we need to wish for that our people are. In fact, it can be the result of a process. I'm going to give you another example. We can look at innovation as different types. We can say it's radical. Maybe the coin example is radical. Like, who would have thought of that as a way to increase savings? And we can look at it as very systematic, maybe boring, but ways to incrementally help the organization, one insight at a time, like the case of the testing the color paper and its impact on helping people pay their bills on time. So in this example, we worked with a company that is an adult education company. And they work with a very unique population. They work with adult learners who are going back to school again for things like vocational training. It's primarily folks who have had very low-wage service jobs, and they've been enticed into getting a career, many of which require licenses to be able to get that career, things like mechanic or a technician for commercial air conditioning. These are trades that require education and then require certification in order to get that kind of job. So this school focused on this kind of adult learner. But it's very difficult as an adult learner. So when we do our behavioral research and we look at the kinds of challenges that adult learners face, they don't have the benefits, for instance, like we did when we were in school growing up. Where all the kids in the neighborhood went to the same school. You had kind of the social support, you had the routine, you had the bus, you had the group going to school together. As an adult learner, typically you're on your own. And then other things like planning. When you're younger, you have your parents, you have your friends, everyone giving you so much pressure to get the homework done, to do well. Adult learners don't have that same kind of support network. So these were things that we determined would be incredibly important to address in our strategy to improve classroom attendance. You see, there's a high correlation between people's likelihood to graduate and their in-classroom attendance. So we thought, let's try a little project where we see if we can increase people's likelihood to go to class. If they are more likely to go to class, then maybe they're going to be more likely to graduate. The challenge in this sector is that the graduation rates are often between 50 and 75%. And so all of the money that's spent on tuition, much of it government funded or out of the individual's pocket, is unutilized. And now not only are they still in these careers that they have, but now they're saddled with very high debt. So this graduation and success is incredibly important to our society. So we wanted to approach this simply. We wanted to approach this just by virtue of the fact that what impact would it have to nudge people on a Sunday night? Hey, go to class this week. And we didn't have a specific hypothesis of should we send them like a text or an email. We weren't sure if there would be a difference. So we tested both of those. And we designed custom messages that use this lack of social belonging or this challenge of being able to make good plans. So we designed messages that leverage those psychological strategies. And here's what we found. Now, when we designed this experiment, the head of the largest campus said, basically, this is stupid. It's not going to work. I'm not in favor of it. But the CEO of the company said, we're going to do it anyways. There's no harm in us trying. There's no harm in us trying to send messages to students on the Sunday night. So we had 700 students who were randomly selected to participate in this, and then we divided the messages out across email, text, and then a baseline control group. And here's what we found. We were able to increase people's likelihood to attend class by 4.5% to 7%, just by sending these little messages. Now, this isn't 100% by a long stretch. But this intervention basically cost the company no money. It was our first time kicking at this, and we had all kinds of learnings, like people's ongoing decrease in attendance, which gives us all kinds of new opportunities and new places to think about customizing the messages and doing new sorts of interventions to continue to improve people's likelihood to attend class. OK, next steps. So behavioral science offers us a framework to operationalize innovation. Behavioral economics can be done as a thing. This is the framework that we've developed over the last 10 years as a way to bring behavioral economics to life, to solve problems in organizations. So first is this research phase. Then there's this strategy phase, and then finally, it's about implementation through experimentation. And I want to take you through each of these elements of our model, step by step, so that you can ideally change how your organization develops its strategies and is more innovative as a result. So first of all, the discovery phase. So I talked about curiosity, like, oh, we're just curious to see what happens if. So how do we make that a part of our process? We gather observations, so we have fundamental data, and we identify measurable, observable behaviors. OK, this thing might seem intuitively obvious, but here's an example of a challenge that we regularly face. We worked with a bank that was spotlighted unfavorably in the national broadcaster for practices that were seen as trying to sell products and services to customers that they didn't need. And employees felt, in the branch, felt like they were being pressured to do this. And when this came to life, it became quite a controversy. We were brought into the organization to help senior leadership rebuild trust. And they were very excited to have our strategies about how to rebuild trust. But the very first thing that we did, and this is going to be a very useful exercise for you, was we asked them to take a piece of paper and a pen and simply define trust on their own. Define trust. When we finished this exercise, we asked them to share their definitions, and here's what we found. The definitions were all over the map, very different from one another, and they were often quite quite shallow in terms of what they actually meant. They didn't leverage the deepest insights that we have from psychology about trust. How can we have an effective and innovative strategy if we don't even have a clear and consistent definition of the thing that it is we're trying to change in the world? Then the second task we had them do was to outline how they would measure it. How do they measure trust so we know our strategies are effective, ineffective, or worse, maybe even backfiring? So before you engage in any project, ensure that you have an operational definition for the measurable, observable behaviors. The second thing is the behavioral diagnostics. This is mining through prior literature, as I've outlined before, to help you understand how consumers are making decisions as they interact with your company and what biases they might be making as they try to understand the best decision to make. Thirdly, ideation. In the realm of behavioral economics, it's about going beyond the cliched, oh, let's just educate consumers. Oh, let's just use loyalty to drive that particular behavior. Behavioral economics is about using biases to nudge behavior. It's about designing a choice architecture that goes beyond those traditional assumptions about what will impact and influence behavior. Next, invest in prototypes and randomized controlled tests. It's a very particular kind of methodology to test your products. This goes significantly beyond the insights that we'll get from things like focus groups that have many biases and flaws inherent within that methodology. This goes significantly beyond mere pilots, where again, we're going to have many flaws that won't let us uncover the true impact of this service in the market. We need to develop a randomized controlled test so that we can see the greatest impact that our strategies have. And that is literally following the same method that we use to develop medicine and bringing that to life inside our organizations to develop and test our strategies. So then when we have our choice architecture, we're ready to have questions in our organization that we can ask and then have that comfort and resolution and being able to answer them. And we can move on and go deeper in terms of our thinking and our actions. So bringing it all together, the benefits then of behavioral science are having access to deeper and richer strategies. It's a repertoire of understanding how people make decisions and unique approaches to influence behavior. It's about enabling risk-taking, because now we have the opportunity to do small-scale experiments and see what happens, but also we actually gain from learning about what doesn't work. We can learn from failure. And then last but not least, my favorite thing about behavioral science is the democratization of ideation. The 15% of you in the room who voted for Coin, whose ideas might not come to life in the boardroom because we don't have a way without experimentation to safely test those ideas. So, in conclusion, the power to transform society and the economy through scientific thinking by bringing to life innovation through science is within you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kelly. I'm behind you.
Oh, hey, Chris.
I'm stalking you. Yeah, Kelly, thank you so much for that. Some really interesting insights. Got lots of questions coming in. So we used the same dynamic as we used earlier with Juan. I think we should have the questions up there very shortly so you can see the ones that are coming in and start voting for the ones that you'd like me to ask Kelly. So we've got about 10 minutes or so. I'd like to begin with a question which actually is not to do with consumers, it's actually to do with employees. Tony asks, other than money, what incentive do you think is more attractive to employees in order to change behavior? Has behavioral economics got anything to say about that?
Absolutely. And you've got a great speaker coming up at your WOBI events next year. Simon Sinek is going to talk all about purpose, helping people have a sense of purpose, have a purpose for your organization that is meaningful, that people can feel connected to, actually is a much greater value than financial compensation. I know even as a CEO, founder of a company, one of the most important things that my co-founders and I developed with our team was a purpose statement. That purpose statement is guided and infused in everything that we do. So when people believe that the work that they're doing matters, we can see in all kinds of experimental conditions, even in the most controlled lab settings, let alone what we see in the real world, experimenting with this can have an important impact. So focusing on purpose and then helping people understand the link between their work and purpose is fantastic. We worked with a tech company with software engineers, and I'll tell you, the tension in this company was very palpable. It was a founder-led company, 30-year-old company, very successful. We called him the old man who founded this company, was brilliant, successful, innovator. But the tension in the company was so high. One of the challenges was that the IT team had no connection between their work and the end customer. So what we did was we actually captured feedback, insight, customers using the product, just some simple videos, a bunch of videos, and then brought them back to the IT team of customers like using the software, interacting with it, saying what role it played in their business. It wasn't anything fancy, actually, but the impact that this had on people and watching the guys kind of, that's neat. And helping them feel a connection between their work, their customer, and making an impact in the real world is very important.
OK, fantastic. Thank you very much. A question here from Manuel, which is actually quite specific to Spain, but you might have some insights on it. So Manuel says that in Spain, the government currently wants to eliminate retirement savings incentives. How do you think these kind of measures, sort of removing these kind of incentives, might impact or could impact citizens' behavior?
Unless something has happened unique to the population in Spain where people are doing an incredible job of putting their money into the banking system already, it's not necessarily going to be a good thing. It could be very bad. Not only bad for individuals, but bad for society, because in absence of those nudges, people tend to make very bad decisions, which then can have ongoing impact on the economy as a whole. Our financial system needs individual savers in order to help our companies have access to capital to be able to invest and help the economy going. So I would be very curious and highly recommend that they do the research that looks at the impact of this on other countries, and maybe consider a small experiment in one of the cities to see what happens to people's savings. It might be worth taking a year, if the policy can wait that period of time, and run an experiment and forecast and see what happens to people when left to their own devices with saving.
OK, thank you.
Good luck with that, guys.
Yeah. It's an interesting question from David. Big data is something that's getting used more and more, and we can sort of infer knowledge about people's behavior from big data. Artificial intelligence is being used more and more, especially in the field of big data, to interpret big data. When you layer on behavioral economics on top of that, David asks, who's going to protect us?
Yeah, that goes back to why I thought it was very important to talk about ethics, because if we have the knowledge of how to impact and influence people in very successful ways, and we have the power of machines to help execute those decisions very quickly in real time, people could regularly be influenced in ways that are potentially unhealthy for them and leave them, overspent, over-tempted, and their resources exhausted. So let's make sure that we're using these tools to help people, to help transform our society, to help us make better financial decisions, to help us make better decisions about how we're using our resources, how we're educating one another and our children. We can use these technologies to help us make much better decisions in all regards. So it behooves us then, for those who want to drive a progressive agenda to help people have better medical decisions, better education decisions, better environmental decisions, to understand these technologies and to use them effectively.
Which is nice in principle, but in practice, there are always going to be people that seek to do something else, that perhaps use this in negative ways. What do we need? How do you protect against that? Do you need watchdogs? Is it sort of regulatory commissions? What are the kind of, have you got any examples in countries that you've worked in where there are systems in place to kind of protect consumers and individuals, society against potential maluse of these practices?
Yeah, I think that we can look to, from a historical perspective, we can look at the evolution of advertising. I mean, these are some of the oldest standards that we have in terms of consumer regulation. Companies can't make promises that are untrue. There's consequences in the market if they do so. So that is one of the areas where we can look to standards for, a good balance between supporting industry and also advocating for the consumer. In the case of technology, data standards are still only still being developed, let alone understanding data standards for more complex or safety standards for more complex technologies. So we actually have quite a ways to go. One of the things that we do know is that disclosures, which are typically used like in financial services or in the healthcare space, so disclosures of things like here are the fees that we earn off of this product. It turns out that disclosures like that, or in the case of healthcare, I'm recommending this particular treatment to you, my patient, but I have a financial interest in this recommendation. In both cases where there's this conflict of interest, traditional regulatory approaches have been to rely on disclosures, or the BE way of saying it is relying on information to help consumers make better decisions. But it turns out that we actually see that that has a backfiring effect. When the advisor is sharing this disclosure with the consumer tends to think, wow, what an honest person, that they would be so transparent with me about the fees. Or how honest of them that they would reveal to me that there's a potential conflict of interest. So what happens is, instead of skepticism going up and then product sales or adoption going down at least some amount, instead we see that trust goes up and those product sales or advice adherence tends to go up, not down. And so this helps us to see things like disclosures, like who reads the disclosures for technology. So we need different approaches to helping consumers understand the impact of the choices that they're making, because we see that, for the benefit of some account, we're willing to give away all kinds of information without thinking through the consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. A question here from Sandra. She asks about what behavioral change you see in consumers in the coming years that might lead to changes in marketing. So it's actually looking maybe sort of beyond behavioral economics, just looking about how we are behaving as consumers, different behavior patterns that you've perhaps seen emerging that might sort of cause new approaches to marketing in coming years.
Yeah, I wish I could say stuff like, consumers are becoming more savvy. I don't think that that's the case. I think that we need to continue to understand the role of these biases in consumer decision making, that we ought to get more sophisticated and develop better and easier products and services for them. Like, why is it still hard to buy insurance? Like, insurance has been around for hundreds of years. Insurance is an important product for every consumer as a way to offset risk that they have in their life.
Yeah.
So if we can actually start to make these experiences for people to buy the right product for the right reason, this would be very beneficial. We see the appeal of like the interfaces, from fintech, but the adoption rates there are still incredibly low. So we have this horrible inertia keeping people from using, products scientists that have, in some cases, absolutely crazy inducements to join the fintech, but people aren't doing it. And so hopefully we'll be able to overcome that inertia to stimulate both incumbent companies and fintechs to develop products that are better for the consumer.
I'm just seeing here our time's up, so I'd like to just have one more question before we do finish. For leaders here that are thinking, this is very interested in behavioral economics and this scientific approach, what would you suggest are some ways of starting to implement some of these ideas within the organization? So how they can start sort of identifying some of these biases and acting accordingly?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer is experiment. A randomized control test that is built upon creating a hypothesis of what you think might influence behavior, predicting the outcome, and then running that experiment. It's so satisfying seeing your ideas brought to life in such a controlled manner, even if it worked or if it didn't work. So actually getting into feeling comfortable, put on the lab coat, act like a scientist, and start to test those strategies, run experiments, and see what happens.
That's great. Great advice. Ladies and gentlemen, Kelly Peters.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Kelly. Thank you so much. Thank you.